It was supposed to be a challenge, not a disappearance. On the morning of June 18, 1997, 7 cyclists pushed off from the edge of Pine Barrens Trail, a heavily wooded stretch in northern Oregon known for its sharp hills and thick tree lines. The sky was clear, the wind calm. It was the kind of day cyclists dream of. The group was a mix of friends and local semi-professionals, all between their late 20s and early 40s. Their goal, a 3-day ride along the old timber trail, a path long retired by trucks and now reclaimed by wilderness. They signed in at the ranger's cabin near the trailhead. One of them, Mark O'Hara, even joked with the park officer, saying, "If we're not back in 3 days, send the dogs." No one laughed, but no one worried either. That was the last time anyone saw them. When they failed to return by the 3rd night, the assumption was mechanical trouble or a slow detour. A local volunteer team hiked the route the next morning. By the 2nd day, state rescue services were involved. All they found were 2 rusted bicycle frames leaned up against a dead cedar and a dented water bottle half submerged in mud. No bodies, no campsite, no tire tracks after a certain bend in the trail. The forest had swallowed them whole. For weeks, families pleaded on television. Flyers went up across counties. A regional news channel did a special titled The Lost Ride, featuring interviews with grieving parents and confused rangers. Then the headline stopped. The case was quietly archived, filed under missing persons. No memorial was ever built. No trails were renamed. No one was held responsible. In the years that followed, hikers stopped using that stretch of forest. There were stories, mostly whispered, a cyclist hearing footsteps that didn't match his cadence, a woman who claimed she saw a man without a face in the trees, but no evidence ever surfaced, just stories. Then 11 years later, in the fall of 2008, the forest caught fire. A dry lightning storm had rolled through in the night, igniting a blaze near the southern ridge. Controlled burns and ranger patrols moved in quickly. In one of the clearing zones, 2 rangers, Henry Wallace and Raphael Chen, stumbled across something that shouldn't have been there. A clearing, deep in the woods, almost perfectly circular. A cold fire pit filled with blackened bones. Half-melted bicycle parts buried beneath moss. And 7 small wooden crosses, barely knee-high, arranged in a row like teeth. No tents, no shelter, no signs of food or survival gear. Just a space that felt too quiet, like the forest had been holding its breath for over a decade. Wallace reported the find. Photos were taken, the site was cordoned off, and just like that, the case reopened, unofficially. The families were contacted again. DNA tests were requested, and a man named David Lynn, who hadn't spoken about his brother's disappearance in over 10 years, finally packed a duffel bag and returned to Pine Barrens. He hadn't hiked since '97. "It's not closure," he said when asked why. "It's guilt. I was supposed to be on that ride." No one asked him to explain further. The truth was simple and terrible. Something had happened out there. Something long buried, possibly forgotten. And now the trees had given up their secret, or at least a part of it. But what happened to the cyclists after that turn in the trail? Why were the bikes hidden? Who built the crosses? And most unsettling of all, were they alone when they died? This time people were listening, but not everyone wanted the truth found. Because even in 2008, some records were still missing. And one man, a former forest warden, had quietly resigned the week the bodies were discovered. He refused to speak, said nothing to press, just disappeared from town like smoke through trees. The story wasn't over. In fact, it had just begun. The Pine Barrens Trail wasn't marked on tourist maps. By 1997, it had already faded into local memory. An old lumber road overgrown with moss and roots, snaking through steep ridge lines and fog-heavy pine. It wasn't part of any official cycling route. The 7 riders took it because it was remote, untouched, and untested. The kind of place where legends are born. But the forest had its own memory, and it hadn't forgotten what was left there. The group left behind a single ride log, a handwritten note left with the ranger at the checkpoint, listing names and intended checkpoints. Mark O'Hara, 36, Elliot Lynn, 31, Sarah Montrose, 28, Kenneth Voss, 42, Nadia Heller, 32, Luis Beck, 34, Trent Moore, 29. They weren't just athletes. Some were EMTs, wilderness guides. 2 were military veterans. They weren't careless, which made their disappearance more unsettling. The first day's ride was smooth. They were seen by 2 campers near Twin Ridge Pass, laughing, riding in a tight formation. A camera left behind in one of the rangers' cabins had a blurry photo dated June 18, 1997. 7 riders, smiling. Not one of them would be seen again. At mile marker 42, the trail narrowed. That's where the official route ended. Beyond that, the road turned rough, a barely visible path carved decades ago by log haulers. Satellite maps taken later would show breaks in the tree line, old switchbacks lost to erosion. But in 1997, there were no drones, no GPS tracks. They went in with paper maps and confidence, and something followed them in. It was Elliot Lynn's journal discovered near the fire pit in 2008 that told a different story. Only a few pages survived, burned around the edges, warped by water. But what remained was unsettling. June 20th, Trent took a fall. Bike frame cracked. Not bad, but he's shaken. Mark says we push forward. Nadia's against it. June 21st, heard something last night. We thought it was wolves. Sarah swears she saw a light in the trees. There's no one out here. June 22nd, something's wrong. The trail doesn't match the map. We doubled back and ended up in the same place. I don't think we're thinking clearly anymore. Then the ink trails off. When David Lynn, Elliot's older brother, read those words in the ranger office, his hands didn't shake. He just looked at the page like he'd already memorized it. I told him not to go, he said. I told him I'd go next time. Behind him, one of the rangers coughed and stepped out of the room. No one asked why. The recovered site, nearly a mile off the original trail, revealed no signs of a struggle. No blood, no remains that could be identified. But someone had stayed there long enough to leave 7 crosses, a smudged journal, and the remnants of burned shoes and inner tubes. There were also carvings, shallow etchings into a tree trunk near the camp. Don't follow the sound. We were not alone. The marks were faint, almost missed. Authorities cataloged the objects, but many of the items disappeared into quiet storage. A Freedom of Information Act request, filed in 2009, was denied on the grounds of active investigation. But no arrests were made. No further search parties launched. Just silence. There was a local who claimed to see something in July of 1997. Miriam Falk, now in her 60s, lived on the edge of the forest and ran a small bait shop. In a 2008 interview, she said, I saw them pass. Week later, I heard screaming. Not regular screaming, like something was wrong in the throat. Not human. Called the sheriff. They told me it was probably coyotes. She shrugged. They always say it's coyotes. The cyclists had families, dreams, photographs. They had plans after the ride. Weddings, jobs, interviews. But none of that mattered to the trail. Whatever waited beyond that bend in the forest didn't care who they were. All that mattered was that no one came back. And for 11 years, no one tried to find out why. The search effort in the summer of 1997 was one of the largest in state history on paper. Dozens of volunteers, trained dogs, helicopters with thermal imaging. From the outside, it looked thorough, official. But those closest to the case knew it wasn't enough. The terrain was too dense, the heat too oppressive, and the trail too easily swallowed by time. The first 48 hours are crucial in any missing persons case. By the time the alarm was raised, nearly 72 hours had passed. That window was already closed. Rescue teams focused on the marked road, assuming the cyclists had stayed within the expected path. It was a logical assumption, but it was also wrong. The southern ridge, where the campsite was eventually discovered in 2008, wasn't even searched. It was dismissed as off-course, too rugged, not logical for cyclists. But logic rarely survives in the wild. Nadia Heller's parents flew in from Minnesota. They were soft-spoken people, not prone to panic. They hiked portions of the trail themselves, side by side with searchers, marking trees with orange tape. They stayed in a rental cabin for 6 weeks, long after the official search was called off. They eventually left behind a note for the rangers. We forgive, but we will never forget. The other families scattered. Some kept calling, some didn't. One father died of a heart attack the following winter. Another mother refused to speak her son's name again. There was no official memorial service. Just a short article in the back of the Daily Oregon Times with the headline, Authorities End Search for Missing Cyclists. But the town never forgot. Local hikers started leaving tokens near the trailhead. Broken bike chains, laminated photos, old ride gloves tied to trees. Some carved initials into bark. Others left compass pins as if to say, You're not lost. We're still looking. Yet the trail changed. Something about it felt different, like a wound that never closed. In 1998, a lone backpacker named Peter Creel reported hearing distant voices along the southern ridge chanting, he claimed, or maybe crying. He turned around and didn't return until 2005 when he was interviewed by a podcast about unsolved wilderness cases. His words were simple. That forest doesn't echo, it absorbs. Even the dogs refused to go certain ways during the original search. Handlers reported that 2 bloodhounds stopped cold at a bend in the trail and began to whimper. No scents were picked up. No prints. Just a kind of stillness. Ranger Micah Larson, who was part of the 1997 search, said something that didn't make it into any report. It felt like the forest didn't want us to find them. That statement, spoken years later during an off-record interview, was met with silence. He died in 2006, 2 years before the campsite was found, never knowing how close they'd come. Back then, there was pressure to wrap the case up. Budget concerns, media fatigue, and whispers, always whispers, that the cyclists had simply chosen to vanish. That theory stuck for a while. People said they joined a cult, that they were tired of modern life, that maybe one of them had snapped. No proof, no motive, just the human need to explain what couldn't be explained. But when the fire revealed the remains 11 years later, those theories died. Someone had stayed there. Someone had built crosses. Someone had burned the rest. In 2008, when the site was excavated, searchers found something else the original teams had missed. A small metal tag, buried in ash, with a name etched in rusted engraving. Eileen, 294. David Lynn identified it immediately. It was the serial tag from Elliot's custom bike. He kept it in his pocket for the rest of the investigation, rubbing it with his thumb until the number wore smooth. He didn't speak much, but when asked how it felt to finally know, he said, I don't know anything yet, because no one knew why they never came back, or how they lasted long enough to leave behind signs of structure, ritual, and sorrow. The forest gave up their bones, but it never gave up the truth. And the deeper investigators looked, the more they realized. There had been someone else out there. She told them. Back in July of 1997, a woman named Geneva Clark walked into the Ranger District office with dirt on her sleeves and a journal in her hand. She was 19 then, working part-time as a volunteer botanist mapping plant growth along the southern ridge. She had been assigned a section of the forest no one liked. They called it Dead Loop. It wasn't marked on most maps, but she was curious. Always had been. She told the rangers she'd seen something. 7 bikes leaned against a broken pine. A man sitting near a fire with a vacant stare. And something else. Not quite a sound, not quite a shadow. Moving behind the trees just beyond where the camp should end. I thought they were just campers, she said. But they didn't wave. They didn't even move when I passed. Like I wasn't there. She went home, wrote down what she saw, and came back the next morning to report it. But the officer on duty, a man named Rick Blanton, didn't take notes. He smiled politely, told her the missing cyclists were likely in another direction. That imagination can get wild out there. She left feeling embarrassed. For 11 years, no one followed up on her story. In 2008, when news of the forest discovery broke, Geneva came forward again. Now a school teacher, she still had the journal entry from that day, dated July 3, 1997. Past old trail loop today. Saw bikes, 7, all leaning the same direction. No tents. One man near fire, not moving. I waved. Nothing. Something's wrong. Trees too quiet. Want to go back tomorrow, but something in me says no. The entry was signed and time-stamped. It matched the estimated location of the campsite. Almost exactly. When investigators contacted Rick Blanton, they found he had retired early in 1998. His personnel file included a complaint marked uncooperative in follow-up response. No details were listed. No action was taken. Geneva didn't want media attention. She didn't care about being right. She just wanted people to understand that something had been missed, and that missing it may have cost lives. I could have led them there, she said in a recorded interview. I just didn't think I needed to scream to be believed. There were others, too. In a nearby village, a hunter named Elias Moore remembered a night in early July when he heard what he described as a distant metal screech, like brakes or gears, but slower. He thought it was thunder, but the sky was clear. He didn't tell anyone. What would he even say? A teenager, Milo Grant, 16 at the time, claimed he saw lights in the forest while night fishing at Crooked Lake. Lantern, he called them, in a place where no one should be. No one believed him. They never believed the people who weren't part of the official search, but they were the ones who saw the edges. In 2009, a post-investigation memo was quietly circulated between agencies. It listed several names of individuals who had offered statements between June and August of 1997. Beside most of them were the words, unverified, no follow-up. Geneva's was on that list. So was Elias. So was Milo. There was a line at the bottom of the memo. Pattern of consistent but disregarded community input suggests institutional blind spot. That's the bureaucratic way of saying,
we were told.
We didn't listen, and now it's too late. David Lynn read Geneva's journal entry during a closed-door meeting at the ranger station. He didn't cry. He just stared at it for a long time. She saw him, he said softly. That was Elliot, sitting by the fire, still alive. Geneva never approached the site again. She said she still hears the quiet sometimes. Not the sound, but the absence of sound. She called it a dead hush, like even the animals were holding their breath. To this day, she doesn't hike alone. This was the pattern. People who saw too much or felt something they couldn't explain were told they were imagining it. That forests don't do that. That people don't just vanish without a trace. But they do. And in this case, someone had been trying to say so all along. The fire that revealed the camp wasn't supposed to burn that far. Lightning had struck dry canopy along the western ridge in September 2008, triggering what was classified as a small, contained surface burn. The rangers expected to monitor it for 2 days and mop up the edges, but a shift in wind pushed the flames deeper, into the part of the forest where no trails had names anymore. That's where Wallace and Chen found it. It didn't look like a camp at first, more like a ruin. 7 wooden crosses, weather-worn but still upright, stood in a rough arc. Bits of scorched rubber and melted alloy lay beneath moss and ash. The remains of bicycle frames, twisted unnaturally, as if crushed or bent by hand. But the worst was what they found in the fire pit. Not bones, not right away. What they saw first were the boots. 7 pairs, carefully arranged in a semicircle. All burned down to the soles, all pointing inward. Later, when the fire died down, they uncovered bone fragments and cracked metal. One of the medics on site vomited behind a tree. It wasn't just the discovery, it was the order. The care. Someone had been there long enough to arrange this, and then leave without a trace. The forensics report confirmed that some of the bones were human. One femur matched DNA from Luis Beck's brother. Another set of dental fragments were consistent with Sarah Montrose, though her parents refused to have it confirmed. But there weren't 7 complete skeletons. Only 5 sets of partial remains were recovered. That left 2 missing. The official report listed the cause of death as undetermined. But privately, one investigator noted something strange. There were no signs of wildlife disturbance. No bite marks, no drag patterns, no scattered remains. It was as if whatever happened had been deliberate, controlled, contained. Near the camp, behind a row of rotting pines, they found something even more disturbing. A set of hand-carved wooden tokens buried under a flat stone. Each one bore an initial burned in with the end of a metal rod, EMKNSTL, each corresponding to the names on the 1997 ride log. But the tokens were worn smooth, like they'd been handled repeatedly, as if someone had been remembering them, or choosing them. The site was closed off within hours. Publicly, it was listed as an unrelated discovery during a fire containment operation. Privately, it sparked panic. Because the location matched the direction Geneva Clark had given. Because Elliot's journal had mentioned someone moving between trees. And because one last item was found nailed to a tree 10 feet above the ground. A small photograph, blurry, water-damaged, but clear enough to see 7 figures standing beside their bikes, all smiling, except for the one on the far left, whose face had been scratched out. David Lynn was shown the photo. He looked at it for a long time, then placed his hand over the scratched face. "That's me," he said. He had taken that picture 3 days before the ride, then given it to Elliot to carry in his pack, which meant someone had taken it from him, and kept it, and left it behind years later after everything was gone. The camp wasn't a shelter. It wasn't a survival attempt. It was a memorial, or maybe a warning. Either way, it shouldn't have existed. Not that deep, not that hidden, not that well preserved after 11 years in a living forest. Wallace, the ranger who found it, resigned 3 months later. He didn't give a reason, just packed a box and left town. But before he left, he mailed a letter to the Beck family. It contained one sentence. They weren't alone, and they weren't supposed to be found. His name was Kenneth Voss, and for nearly a decade he was just one of the missing. No confirmed remains, no identified belongings. Just a name on a ride log and a face in a group photo. Until 2006, when a man matching Kenneth's description was found wandering along Route 12, nearly 80 miles from Pine Barrens Trail. He was barefoot, drenched in mud, carrying a bicycle chain wrapped around his right hand. At the time, local authorities believed he was a transient, possibly mentally ill, possibly on drugs. He gave no name, didn't speak, just kept muttering the same three words. It knew first. He was taken into psychiatric care under the name John Doe, 44. It wasn't until 2 years later, after the camp was discovered, that a nurse happened to see a flyer posted on a bulletin board outside the hospital's records room. She recognized the eyes. DNA matched. It was Kenneth. He had survived, somehow. But what he remembered didn't make sense. According to his sparse medical records, Kenneth was nonverbal for most of his first year in care. He responded to loud noises by collapsing into fetal position. He refused to sleep near windows, and he never touched food if it had been left unattended. In late 2007, after a slow rehabilitation process, he began writing again. Mostly fragments. Mostly nonsense. The bikes were wrong. We weren't supposed to go past the bend. Mark went first, or maybe last. I don't know anymore. The forest makes copies. We were kept like jars. None of it fit a clean narrative. But one line, written and rewritten dozens of times in the margins of his intake form, stood out. I'm not me anymore. When David Lynn visited him in 2009, he brought a photo of the group. Kenneth flinched, then pointed to his own face, and said, he stayed behind. When asked what that meant, he only responded, some of us died, some of us changed. Doctors initially believed Kenneth was suffering from trauma-induced dissociative disorder, possibly psychosis triggered by prolonged isolation, but the timeline never made sense. Where had he been for 9 years? How had he survived without being seen, found, or identified? And why, despite physical evidence, did he bear no signs of starvation or long-term exposure? No scars, no fractures, no frostbite, just a single round burn on his right shoulder, the shape of an old bicycle handlebar end, as if something had marked him. When the press discovered his identity, theories exploded. Survivor guilt, secret cults, underground bunkers. Some claimed Kenneth had been part of whatever happened, that he stayed behind while the others were taken. But there was no evidence. Just a man who refused to be alone in the dark, and who, when the lights flickered, whispered a single phrase under his breath. It listened. In his final recorded statement, just days before he disappeared from the facility in late 2010, Kenneth left behind a note scribbled in shaky pencil. If you find this, don't dig. Don't try to map it. It moves. The trail moves. And it remembers every footstep. To this day, Kenneth Voss has never been found again. Some say he wandered back into the forest. Some believe he never left it to begin with. But those who knew the case, the real case, know one thing. Someone made it out. And even he didn't know how. The final break in the case came not from a body or a confession or some lost journal buried under moss, but from a locked steel container pulled from a ravine near Crag's End Bluff, just 5 miles south of the original campsite. It had been buried deep in mud, likely dislodged by flooding after a storm in 2009. Rangers found it lodged beneath an uprooted cedar, sealed with rusted bolts. It took 2 men and a crowbar to open it. Inside was a mess of damp documents. Most were ruined, but a few had survived. Handwritten pages, initialed in the margins SM, Sarah Montrose, a final account. Her final days. Wow, we are not alone here. We've circled the same bend 3 times. I marked the trees. The marks vanish. Mark says we passed the same stump twice. Luis doesn't believe him. They fought last night. Elliot tried to separate them. Something outside mimics Trent's voice. But Trent's asleep. There were 32 pages in total. Most of them unreadable, smudged ink, torn corners, mold. But the entries that remained pieced together a terrifying reality. The group had lost direction by day 4. Their map had failed them. But the panic set in when they realized the compasses had stopped working. Not spinning randomly, just frozen, still, like the forest had stopped time. Sarah wrote of sounds in the trees, of seeing things, reflections of herself, just slightly off. A laugh that sounded like Nadia's but came from beneath the ground. A knock on her tent wall when no one else was awake. Then came the line that froze investigators. Something was learning us. trying to act like us. Each day it gets closer. There was no mention of how the group began to vanish. No clear turning point, just a slow decline. On day 6, she wrote, Kenneth hasn't spoken in a day. He stares at the fire like it talks back. On day 7, we woke up and Elliot's pack was gone. So was Mark. We searched for 6 hours, found only the photo, but now the picture's wrong. What Sarah meant by that, no one can say. The last page was incomplete, just a few final lines. It wants the ride to repeat. It wants more names. I think we were chosen, or maybe called. I buried this because I think I'll forget myself next. Tell David I remember his voice. That last sentence broke something in him. David Lynn was there when the letter was authenticated. He read it once quietly, then again out loud, voice cracking on the name. She was trying, he said. She was fighting it. The presence that had stalked them wasn't just a force of nature. It was a system, a memory built into the land. Something that copied, erased, and then waited. After the discovery, the state quietly redrew forest boundaries. The southern trails were declared unstable. Public access was permanently revoked for conservation and safety. But everyone involved knew the real reason. The final item inside the container wasn't paper. It was a rusted bicycle pedal, wrapped in cloth, tucked carefully beneath Sarah's pages. On it were 7 carved lines, 6 crossed out, 1 left untouched. There was no press release, no media event, only a closed-door meeting, a digital scan filed under restricted records, and a phrase that appeared in the margin of the official report. There is no trail marker for memory, but that wasn't true. The land remembered. Sarah remembered. Kenneth remembered enough to run, and now someone else knew. Because when her words reached her brother, when the story finally broke the seal of silence, it did more than close a case. It reopened a wound. And that's when people finally began to ask the real question, not where they went, but what brought them there in the first place. In 2011, 14 years after the disappearance, and 3 years after the burned campsite was found, a small memorial plaque was quietly installed at the trailhead where the group began their ride. No ceremony, no cameras, just 7 names etched into bronze fastened to a cedar post. A ranger placed a single white bike glove at its base. It was meant as closure. But no one called it that. Closure implies a door has shut. But what if the door never really closed? What if it just moved deeper into the woods? David Lynn never gave interviews after that. He refused podcasts, turned down documentaries. The only words he left behind were handwritten in a small local zine. We thought it was just a ride. We didn't know the land remembers everything, even things we bury. He moved to a coastal town and never wrote again. Locals said he took long walks by the sea, always alone, always listening. He passed away in 2021. No cause of death was released. His last possession was a weathered photograph, the same one found at the burned camp, with his own face scratched out. No one knows who did that. Maybe it was Elliot. Maybe it was Kenneth. Or maybe David did it himself. A final act of grief or guilt or gratitude that he survived when the rest didn't. As for Kenneth Voss, he was never seen again. The hospital records show he left his room late one night without alerting staff. Security footage captured him stepping into the tree line at dawn, barefoot, carrying nothing. Some say he went back to the forest to find peace. Others believe he was always meant to return. The forest trail was eventually decommissioned. Maps were redrawn. The southern ridge was renamed Preservation Zone 3. No public access, no overnight permits. Satellite scans show regrowth. Trees thicker now than they were in 1997. The terrain has shifted, but hikers still report strange sensations near the old site. Like being watched. Like you've already walked that path before. Like something is walking just behind you, but never catches up. A child once found a rusted spoke in the dirt near Crooked Lake. His mother threw it into the water. The next day, they found it resting on their cabin step. They left before sunset. They never came back. The story faded from the public eye. Time does that. People forget, but the forest does not. It keeps what it's given. It mimics, it preserves, it waits. Sarah Montrose's final journal page, the one no one could verify, included a line written backwards, as if in a mirror. It's not the land that's haunted. It's the memory. To this day, no official explanation exists for how 7 experienced cyclists disappeared, why only fragments were ever found, or how Sarah's writings survived intact inside a sealed steel box in the middle of nowhere. Authorities list the case as closed partial recovery, but locals still whisper about the unnamed bend, the frozen compasses, and the way voices sometimes carry in the woods, soft, familiar, calling names only the missing would know. In the end, it wasn't about finding bodies. It wasn't even about solving a mystery. It was about what the survivors carried. The questions with no answers. The sound of someone calling your name in the dark, long after they're gone. The image of friends who were smiling and then suddenly weren't. The terrible weight of being the one who came back. Nothing was rebuilt. No new trail was carved. No one camped there again. But the wind still moves through those trees. And the forest, silent as it seems, is always listening. Final line etched into the memorial post, added years later by an unknown hand. They didn't forget the trail. The trail remembered them.